The initial occasion, I delivered a lecture, a genuine academic presentation, a seminar at Princeton in 1941. I was 23 years old, absolutely terrified. Present in that room were individuals whose names you might recognize: Einstein, Pauli, and von Neumann. I'm positioned there with my legs trembling, attempting to explain some research I'd been conducting, and I noticed von Neumann sitting there. He's not recording anything. He's simply listening, observing. And you sense that he's not merely keeping up. He's already several steps ahead, anticipating where you're heading before you arrive there yourself. However, that wasn't when I truly witnessed what his mind could accomplish. That occurred subsequently at Los Alamos. You understand, by 1943, we were all situated in New Mexico working on the explosive device. It represented this extraordinary gathering of the finest scientific intellects globally, all isolated on this plateau in the middle of nowhere. And von Neumann, Johnny we called him, he wasn't even stationed there permanently. He'd appear as an advisor, but when he arrived, it resembled someone had activated a mechanism that made all our difficulties suddenly appear, I don't know, manageable. Allow me to provide an illustration. We faced this immense challenge with the implosion configuration. You needed to compress this sphere of plutonium from every direction simultaneously using these explosive lenses. The computations were brutal, absolutely brutal. We're discussing shock waves, fluid dynamics, all these phenomena occurring within millionths of a second, and the mathematical expressions, partial differential equations, requiring numerical integration. Nobody truly understood how to approach them. I supervised some of the computational efforts. We possess these IBM devices, and when I mention computing devices, I don't refer to what you imagine nowadays. I indicate we had rooms filled with individuals operating mechanical calculators, punching cards, transferring them along like a production line. I had developed this approach where I'd explain to all the operators what they were actually computing, what the device was, why it mattered, and that increased their efficiency about tenfold. They began suggesting their own enhancements to the procedure. It was remarkable, actually. Yet despite all that, these calculations required enormous time, days, weeks, and we weren't even confident we were performing them correctly. So one day, Johnny von Neumann appears. He's dressed in one of his three-piece outfits. He consistently wore these costly suits. Even when we'd go hiking in the mountains, he'd ride a mule wearing a three-piece suit. It represented the most peculiar thing. Anyway, he enters the space where Enrico Fermi and several others are gathered around a chalkboard, and they've been addressing this specific challenge for hours. These represent brilliant individuals. Fermi, for heaven's sake, and they're stumped. Von Neumann stands there for perhaps, and I'm not exaggerating, perhaps 90 seconds. He's merely observing the chalkboard with this vacant expression. You cannot discern his thoughts. Then he approaches, grasps the chalk, and simply begins inscribing. No dialogue? No, allow me to consider this. He writes out the resolution systematically like he's transcribing from a text only he can perceive. Fermi examines it and remarks something like, yes, naturally, but you can perceive he's unsettled. We're all unsettled because it's not merely that Johnny obtained the answer, it's the rapidity, it's the complete confidence. Now allow me to share something else. On one occasion, I believe this was earlier before Los Alamos, someone presented Johnny with a classic puzzle about the insect and the bicycles. You're familiar with this one? Two bicycles are 20 kilometers apart, cycling toward each other at 10 kilometers per hour. An insect starts on one bicycle and flies back and forth between them at 15 kilometers per hour. What distance does the insect cover before the bicycles meet? Most individuals, upon initially hearing this, attempt to compute the distance for each segment of the insect's journey, and some the infinite sequence. That represents the difficult approach. The simple approach, the insight, is to recognize the bicycles meet in 1 hour. Therefore, the insect flies for 1 hour at 15 kilometers per hour, 15 kilometers. Straightforward. I recognized this during secondary school fairly quickly. I perceived the insight. When someone presented von Neumann with this identical question, he produced the correct response immediately within seconds. So the individual who asked him remarked, "Oh, you must have encountered the insight previously." And von Neumann regards him puzzled and responds, "What insight? I calculated the infinite sequence. You comprehend what I'm conveying?" He didn't perceive the shortcut. He didn't require it. He simply added the infinite sequence mentally instantaneously. That doesn't represent the same type of mind you and I possess. Hans Bethe, he received the Nobel Prize. brilliant individual, among the finest. He once expressed something that remained with me. He stated, "I have occasionally pondered whether a mind like von Neumann's does not suggest a species superior to that of man." And subsequently he phrased it even more directly. Von Neumann's mind suggested a novel species, an advancement beyond humanity. Now you might consider that mere poetic embellishment, but I witnessed him function. I observed him reason, and something genuinely distinct occurred. Allow me to attempt to clarify what I intend. You understand how, when you're attempting to resolve a challenge, you can somewhat sense your mind operating. You're maneuvering concepts around, attempting various methods, retreating when something fails. It requires effort. It's a procedure. With von Neumann, it didn't appear that way. It appeared more like, like a photographic device capturing an image. The information would enter and the response would emerge with almost no interval between, and not merely straightforward matters. Incredibly complex calculations, challenges requiring the rest of us days or weeks. On one occasion at Los Alamos, we were performing calculations regarding the device outputs. Attempting to determine what level of devastation these items would actually produce. Von Neumann had developed some simplifications that enabled estimating the effects based merely on the excess pressure. He comprehended shockwave reflections more thoroughly than anyone, and he computed the optimal altitude for activation. I recall sitting with some of the other individuals, and someone commented about how Johnny could perform calculations mentally 10 times faster than anyone else. And Enrico Fermi, one of the giants, he stated, "You understand, Johnny can perform calculations mentally 10 times as rapidly as I can, and I can perform them 10 times as rapidly as you can. So you can appreciate how remarkable Johnny is." This is Fermi speaking. Fermi, who constructed the initial nuclear reactor personally. Fermi, who could estimate virtually anything. And he's stating von Neumann is 100 times faster than a typical physicist. Yet it wasn't merely speed. That's not even the most fascinating aspect. It was the breadth. This individual worked on everything. Pure mathematics, quantum mechanics, economics, game theory, the fundamentals of computing, fluid dynamics, nuclear weapon design. Edward Teller stated that von Neumann contributed to every branch of mathematics except number theory and topology. Reflect on that. Every other branch of mathematics. And his recollection, my goodness, his recollection. Hermann Goldstein, who collaborated with him on computer architecture, stated that von Neumann could peruse a book or article once and reproduce it verbatim years afterward in a different language. Goldstein tested him once by inquiring how A Tale of Two Cities commences. Von Neumann immediately began reciting the initial chapter word for word and continued for 10 or 15 minutes until Goldstein requested him to cease. As a child in Budapest, his parents would entertain guests by having him memorize pages of the telephone directory at a glance. At 6 years old, he could divide 8-digit numbers mentally and converse humorously in ancient Greek. Now, here's what genuinely provoked my contemplation. Von Neumann himself became intensely interested in how brains functioned. Following the war, he started comparing the brain to computers, to the very computers he was assisting to create. And he wrote about this in a volume titled The Computer and the Brain. What he recognized was that the brain and the computer both represent universal computing devices, yet they're constructed on entirely different architectures. He estimated that neurons operate millions of times slower than vacuum tubes, the components we were utilizing in early computers. And still, the brain excels at certain categories of calculations. How is that feasible? The explanation is parallel processing. The brain possesses 10 billion neurons all operating simultaneously. It's massively parallel. The computer he was constructing operated sequentially, one step following another, yet each step incredibly rapid. And here's what captivates me. Von Neumann concluded that the brain must employ a completely different kind of language, a different kind of mathematics, different logical principles than anything we'd invented for computers. Because if the brain employed the identical methods computers employ, it would be too slow. The architecture wouldn't function. Yet here's the aspect that kept me awake at night considering it. If von Neumann's brain employed some different operating system than the rest of us, some more efficient algorithm, could he perceive it internally? Could he comprehend what was different about his own reasoning? I'm uncertain. We never actually discussed it in that manner. Von Neumann wasn't introspective regarding his own capabilities. He simply utilized them. Like a musician with perfect pitch doesn't contemplate having perfect pitch. They simply perceive the notes. I recall taking strolls with him at Los Alamos. The location was isolated, desolate sometimes, and we'd walk and converse. He shared something with me that I've reflected upon frequently throughout the years. He stated that recognizing how uncertain the outcomes of our actions are, you shouldn't permit them to burden your conscience excessively. At that time, we were constructing a weapon that would eliminate hundreds of thousands of individuals. And here's von Neumann, who could compute the precise optimal altitude to activate that weapon for maximum devastation, advising me not to be overly concerned about the outcomes. Was that because his brain operated differently? Because he could perceive the logic so distinctly that the emotional weight didn't intrude? Or was it merely his method of managing what we were undertaking? I never completely resolved that. One insight I gained from observing him, and this holds significance, is that intelligence isn't singular. It's not a single measurement, not a single capability. Von Neumann's brain excelled extraordinarily at certain categories of operations: memory, calculation, logical analysis, pattern recognition. Yet that doesn't equate to wisdom. It doesn't equate to creativity in the manner we typically conceive it. I mean, I received the Nobel Prize for work on quantum electrodynamics. Von Neumann didn't work on that. He worked on the mathematical underpinnings of quantum mechanics, which holds importance certainly, yet he didn't develop QED. He didn't create those diagrams that ultimately bore my name. And he probably could have if he directed that brain toward that area, yet he didn't. There's something regarding scientific creativity that differs from pure computational capability. It involves selecting which challenges to address, which inquiries to pose. It involves intuition and physical comprehension, not merely logical processing. And you know what's amusing? They administered an IQ assessment to me once. When I was youthful, I scored a 125. That's respectable. It's above average, yet it's not remarkable. Meanwhile, individuals estimate von Neumann's IQ was approximately 190 or even higher. Yet here's what that reveals to me. IQ measures something. Certainly, it measures a specific category of mental processing, speed, and pattern recognition, yet it doesn't measure everything that holds significance. It doesn't measure the capability to discover novel approaches to examining problems. It doesn't measure determination, and you require determination to address difficult challenges for years. It doesn't measure the delight of discovery, which sustained my motivation. Von Neumann could calculate more rapidly than anyone I ever encountered. Yet could he experience the elegance of physics the way I did? Could he play the bongos and figure out how to pick locks and experience that unrestrained joy of comprehending something novel? I'm uncertain. We possess different categories of minds. I believe here's another aspect. Von Neumann worked across so many different domains that he never explored as profoundly into any single one as he might have. He was broad, incredibly broad. He could perceive connections between fields that nobody else perceived. That's powerful. Yet occasionally you need to explore deeply to inhabit a challenge for months or years until you genuinely comprehend it instinctively. I recall one occasion, must have been 1945 or thereabouts, we were all discussing the future of physics, where the discipline was heading, and someone inquired von Neumann what he thought regarding some issue in particle physics. He reflected for a moment, one of those brief moments where you could observe the calculation occurring, and then he provided this response that was perfectly logical, perfectly reasoned, and completely overlooked a point because he hadn't inhabited that challenge. He hadn't developed the physical intuition. He could calculate, yet he couldn't sense it, and that's when I recognized his brain was different. Yes, extraordinarily different, yet it wasn't superior at everything. It was optimized for specific categories of operations: lightning-quick logical processing, flawless memory retrieval, instantaneous pattern matching. Yet my brain could accomplish things his couldn't, similarly to how a musician's brain can perceive things that mine cannot. The tragedy is that we lost him so young. He passed away in 1957, age 53. Cancer, probably from radiation exposure. By then, he'd revolutionized mathematics, assisted in constructing the atomic bomb, essentially invented the modern computer, established game theory, made fundamental contributions to quantum mechanics and economics. Envision what he might have accomplished with another 30 years. Yet here's what I want you to comprehend. Observing von Neumann's brain function taught me something essential about intelligence and about science. It taught me that different forms of brilliance exist, different ways a mind can be extraordinary. It taught me that even the most powerful calculating mechanism ever contained within a human skull still possesses constraints. And it taught me something about myself. because I couldn't compete with von Neumann regarding pure processing capability. Nobody could. I needed to discover different approaches to contribute. I needed to cultivate my intuition, my physical insight, my capability to discover novel methods of visualizing challenges. I needed to learn to think in images and diagrams and physical comparisons. In a manner, recognizing that someone like von Neumann existed, someone with that type of raw computational capability, it liberated me. It meant I didn't have to attempt to be him. I could be myself with my slower, yet perhaps more physically grounded method of reasoning. You know what von Neumann once stated? Someone inquired what percentage of all mathematics an individual could realistically expect to comprehend, given how extensively the field had expanded. He reflected for precisely 5 seconds. Individuals timed these matters with him and stated approximately 28%. 28%. Not 30, not 25, 28. That's the kind of precision his brain operated with. He performed some calculation mentally regarding the rate of mathematical publication, the amount an individual could realistically peruse and comprehend, and arrived at that specific figure. I could never reason like that. My brain doesn't function that way. If you pose that question to me, I'd respond something like, well, nobody can comprehend everything anymore. You simply concentrate on what interests you, not 28%. Yet here's the beautiful aspect regarding science. We required both categories of brains. We required von Neumann with his remarkable computational capability, his ability to perceive logical connections instantly, his flawless memory. And we required individuals like myself who contemplated physics in a more intuitive visual manner. We required Hans Bethe, who was incredibly practical and could estimate anything. We required Fermi with his remarkable physical intuition. We required Einstein, who reasoned in completely different ways than any of us. The way I perceive it, von Neumann's brain resembled possessing a supercomputer, the most powerful computing device ever constructed, yet operating on biological material instead of electronic components. The processing speed was remarkable. The memory was flawless. The logical operations were faultless. Yet it was still computing. It was still executing algorithms. Even if they were algorithms nobody else could match. And perhaps that's why he became so fascinated with comparing brains and computers. Perhaps he recognized something regarding his own thinking, that it was more computer-like than most individuals, more algorithmic, more purely logical. I occasionally ponder what von Neumann would think of contemporary computers, contemporary AI systems. He'd probably be fascinated and disappointed concurrently. Fascinated because they're so much more powerful than the devices he constructed. Disappointed because they still don't reason the way a brain reasons, even his brain. Because despite all his computational capability, von Neumann remained human. He appreciated humor and gatherings. He had 3 spouses throughout his lifetime. He cherished expensive automobiles and fine cuisine. On his deathbed, when his mental faculties were deteriorating, which must have been terrifying for someone whose mental faculties constituted his defining characteristic. He had someone read Thucydides to him in ancient Greek, and he corrected their pronunciation errors. So, what did I observe when I observed von Neumann's brain? I observed something genuinely different from anything else I've encountered. I observed a level of computational capability that appeared nearly non-human in its rapidity and precision. I observed flawless recall and instantaneous pattern recognition. Yet I also observed the constraints. I observed that even the most powerful thinking mechanism in human form remains constrained by what thinking mechanisms can accomplish. There's something about human creativity, about scientific intuition, about the ability to make bold leaps and pose unusual questions, cannot be diminished to pure computation regardless of speed. And I learned something essential. We're not all constructed identically. Some of us possess brains optimized for one category of thinking, some for another. Von Neumann's brain represented the most powerful calculating engine I ever encountered. Yet that doesn't render my brain or your brain valueless in comparison. It signifies we reason differently, we contribute differently. The essential matter is to recognize what your brain excels at and utilize it. Don't attempt to be von Neumann if you're not constructed that way. I wasn't. I needed to discover my own trajectory, my own method of comprehending physics. And you know what? It turned out satisfactorily. So yes, I observed von Neumann's brain and I witnessed something not entirely human in its capabilities. Yet I also witnessed the elegance of diversity in how we reason, how we address challenges, how we comprehend the universe. And that to me represents the genuine insight.